course, I could give you a short summary, well, it wouldn't be too short, of how Dan Rather has earned the title of the hardest working man in broadcast journalism, of how he went from newspapers to radio to television, not to mention the book he did with Gary called The Palace Guard, and of how Dan is now on cable TV and on Facebook where he has 2.7 million followers, and of how he also has his own independent production company called News and Guts. I could do that, but I won't. I won't mention any of it. All of you know of Dan's reputation and of his accomplishments. I think I'd rather read you a few of the quotes that I found on his Facebook page and elsewhere on the internet. First, Americans will put up with anything, provided it doesn't block traffic. A tough lesson in life that one has to learn is that not everybody wishes you well. Another one, don't taunt the alligator until after you've crossed the creek. And finally, ratings don't last. Good journalism does. And then there's Gary, columnist, author, producer. Let me tell you my one very favorite quote of Gary's. It was when he asked me a few months ago, Bernie, how would you like to have Dan Rather speak to the Silurians? By the way, this is Gary.
Bernie has no idea what a setup he's just given me, so I will seize on it. Aha, notes. Around the time the Palace Guard was published, and for some time thereafter, I would be asked from time to time how it came to pass that Dan Rather wrote it with a co-author whom Time magazine, in its very first-rate review of the book, described as Rather's, quote, lesser-known colleague. That phrase came to the attention of some of our smart-ass colleagues at CBS, one of whom cited it as that season's most galling redundancy. Anyway, but then I'd get around to answer the question, which was simply answered. It was at least conceived, if not born, over late-night drinks at a pub called P.J. Moriarty's. Dan was in, first of all, this is the early 70s, and he already had made a big name for himself covering the Nixon White House. And in recognition of that, the corporate poobahs at CBS decided to have him anchor his own show. And it was a weekly news broadcast on Sunday night, and every weekend he would come up to New York. And in doing so, he also inherited a tradition that his predecessor in that side, Harry Reasoner, would invite the staff to go over to Moriarty's after the broadcast for snacks and drinks. Dan was all too happy to pick up the mantle of that, but he had one caveat. He politely asked if we refrain from asking him a lot about what he does with his days during the week. I think he welcomed the Sunday night assignment as a respite from 6 days of covering the Nixon White House. And we pretty much honored that. But as he became more relaxed with us and we got to know him better, he changed. And he would give us tidbits here and there. And there was finally a really kind of unusually special night in early 1972. We were sitting around having a few pops and snacks. And the show's editor, Ray Gandolf, just kind of announced out of the blue that they said that of all the bad apples in the Nixon administration, the worst had to be John Mitchell. And with that, he looked to Dan for confirmation, and our eyes looked to Dan for confirmation. And what Dan said was, yeah, Mitchell can be a hard ass from time to time, but if you're concerned about this crowd, the guys you really need to worry about are his two top aides inside the White House, Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman. Those are the first times in over a year of these Sunday night things that those two names had been mentioned. That's how below the radar they were at the time. This is several months before the Watergate burglary, more than a year before the cover-up exploded. And we weren't even sure who they were. I for one, thought Ehrlichman was the ad executive and Haldeman was the other one. So, but he began to tell us stuff, and so in the argot of the time, perhaps, I asked him, I said, Dan, at that point in time, what did you know about these two guys, and how the hell did you know it?
Well, first of all, Gary, let me pause and say I'm glad to be here, and I really am very appreciative of all of you turning out on a snowy New York day. So thank you very much for being here.
Better?
Shall we handhold it and close? Thank you, but I appreciate all of you being here. Second, and I am going to answer Gary's question, but I will make sure that everybody understands the context we're talking here. That Gary and I did a book in 1974, the first book for both of us, as true collaborators. You know, sometimes several names are on the cover, but it hasn't been a true collaboration. A true collaboration. And the Palace Guard, I don't say this by any way of bragging, but it was a miracle for us that it became a #1 New York Times bestseller, sent both of my children to college, and kept Gary afloat for a few years. Anyway, that's the context in which we're talking. And
paid off my gambling debts.
And what Gary says about those nights at Moriarty's, which unfortunately is an Irish bar that is no longer with us, I still have very fond memories of those nights because our last broadcast at that time was done at 11 o'clock in the evening. And the sessions with adult beverages, which Gary describes, reminded me then and now of the old saying that politicians, hangmen, and journalists do their best work after midnight. And it is out of those conversations at Moriarty's with our broadcast staff, talking the wee hours of the morning the book was born. In answer to your question, Gary, about, but when we started talking about the book, which my recollection is we first started talking about a magazine article, quite honestly,
Yeah.
I could not imagine that I could do a book, and if I did one, I couldn't imagine anybody would buy it. We talked about possibly doing a magazine article about Haldeman and Ehrlichman, who had not received much attention at that time. So the answer to your question of what I knew and how did I know it, I didn't know anything about what eventually became known for shorthand as Watergate. And of course, a reminder that shorthand word Watergate is short for a widespread criminal conspiracy that was led, unfortunately, by the President of the United States himself. But in 1972, when we were every Sunday night imbibing a little and talking about how great we used to be, I had no idea, the break-in itself later, had no idea. What I did have an idea was how powerful Haldeman and Ehrlichman were, and that they were the most powerful influences around Richard Nixon at that time. Henry Kissinger was sort of a set apart in foreign policy. But the way I knew it is I showed up at the White House. I was chief White House correspondent for CBS News. I showed up every morning early, stayed late, made telephone calls as best I could. Fair to say that the Nixon White House was a far cry from the Trump White House in that I wouldn't say it was leak-proof, but it was pretty close to that. So, as a White House correspondent, then and now, if you're going to do the job well, you listen to the daily briefings, you call people in the White House and ask them to talk to you, but at least get on record that you have called them, and then you start working the outside. What one finds out about what's going on in the White House then and now, certainly true of my own experience, was you had to have sources on Capitol Hill, you had to know congressmen, senators, their staffs, people at the Pentagon. I had covered the war in Vietnam during the 60s. Now we're in the 70s. Some of the people who were lieutenants and majors in Vietnam are now ranking officers at the Pentagon. At any rate, you make telephone calls and you meet people outside. And everybody said to me, the whole story outside of Nixon himself are these two guys, Haldeman and Ehrlichman. It made sense to me, so I began following him and getting as much information as I could, because there is what I jokingly call one of Rather's rules of Washington power, and that is that power is in direct proportion to proximity, which is to say those who are around the power, whether it be a cabinet position or in the case of the presidency, those who are around the president the most, those who talk to him in person the most, those who are the closest to him generally will have the most power. So working off of that, I began to think about Haldeman and Ehrlichman and hear about how powerful they were. And Gary, I do want to pause and get back to Gary and move this along. But Gary picked up right away. I just, frankly, these sessions at Moriarty were, late night bull sessions of a sort. I didn't make much of them. But Gary had the good sense to pick up on what was being said. And the book, for all that it accomplished in terms of personal finances for the two of us and elsewhere, is mainly due to Gary.
Okay.
I'm here to tell you we won't argue about it.
Okay.
But Gary had the vision. When Gary first said to me, sort of to hell with the magazine article, let's do the book, I'm afraid I looked at him like he was a hitchhiker with pets and just said, what's wrong with you? We can't do a book. But Gary had the vision. He believed. He's a very good writer himself, and he really is the person who pushed it through.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. He's never said that to me before. So, but I'll tell you, I was struck by, I'll tell you what really piqued my curiosity. And there's a recent promo on MSNBC that comes up, and it starts off by saying, the full story is never from the podium. It goes on, and it goes on to say, if you want to do the full story, you're not going to get it from, those are handouts. Those are verbal handouts. I mean, that's all that they are. And up until then, I think I, like many other people, thought the White House correspondent job was to cover the news conferences and also the press briefings. Ron Ziegler, bless him. But when he started telling us stuff about what was going on inside that he was picking up from really working the beat and working it deep. And I remember asking him one time, I said, how come this you can't get this out on the air? And he said, well, you know where we work. You're lucky if you get a minute 30 stand-up in front of the White House. You're supposed to, it couldn't be done. It was too nuanced, it was too complicated, it was too, it could have been done in a documentary, but I hesitate to try to figure the reaction of our bosses if you had gone in there and said you wanted to do a documentary on that. Anyway, thank you. The other thing I wanted to get into, although it's fair to say that Haldeman and Ehrlichman are probably the central characters in the Palace Guard, we set out to shed as much light as we possibly could on an extremely complicated man named Richard Nixon. He was once asked what he treasured most from his Quaker heritage. Clearly wasn't charity and things like that, man. And he said, my privacy. And we thought, and we talked about that, and then Dan told me something a few days after the 1972 re-election. That, think of it, this is the crowning moment of his political life. He destroyed the government and the thing, 49 states out of 50. He became, he joined Franklin D. Roosevelt as the only other man in the history of the Republic to have run for national office 5 different times. 3 as president, 2 as vice president Roosevelt. I mean, this is a day to end all, or a night to end all nights. Nixon spent it in that study he had where he had the fireplace on all the time. It was the summer, he turned on the air conditioning to do it. Alone. Every once in a while, Haldeman would come in with the latest returns and he'd say, thank you. Let's talk about that. Isn't that strange?
Well, it was strange, and it is strange that I have done some research, but I challenge anyone to challenge this if you want. But I don't think any president in the history of the country has gone through election night by himself, alone. That some presidents are more gregarious than others. But the picture of Richard Nixon, and Gary is good at setting the stage, he was in the book and he is here. This is the crowning achievement for Richard Nixon. Yes, he had been elected in 1968 as president, but you know, he had run as a congressman from California, a senator, 2 terms as vice president. He had won the 1968 election, but here in 1972 was his ultimate victory. Because for him, and this is the way Richard Nixon thought, one doesn't have to be a psychoanalyst to understand this much about Richard Nixon. It was one of the things in the end that contributed to his demise. But Richard Nixon had become a person who was absolutely obsessed, not just with beating his opponent, but with destroying his opponents. Big difference between the two. And he had obliterated McGovern and the Democratic movement for all intents and purposes. So here is his, ultimate night, and he is alone with the fireplace. And Gary's described it well, and I think we did too in the book for that matter. That Haldeman would come in occasionally and slip him a note about something to do with the results. Now, what this told us about Richard Nixon at the time was that, one, he'd long been described as a loner, and everybody sort of thought he's a classic loner. But the depths of his concern about privacy were not apparent until that word got out, which, by the way, I think Haldeman was the first one to describe what had happened election night, because Haldeman, who was, and God rest his soul, but I'll say it, Haldeman was a fairly weird duck himself. But I think Haldeman thought that it really spoke well for Nixon. That's the reason he let the story out, if you will. He thought it cast Richard Nixon as a very thoughtful, reflective person. And I suppose in a stretch one could read it that way. But the point here is that President Nixon had a reputation before then of being a classic loner. Some described him as being paranoid. Frankly, I never knew enough about psychology and psychiatric studies to know whether he was paranoid or not. But he did have this extreme sense of, number one, privacy, keeping his own secrets with himself, even from his family and his staff. Number two, he had developed this, I think it had always been with him since his childhood, but I can't attest to that. But I think over the period he was in politics, he developed this feeling about himself, they're all against me. Everybody.
Us versus them, yeah.
Eventually, they're all against him. So he was a very intelligent person, for whatever it may be, whatever you think it needs to be said. Nixon, of the kind of intelligence that is found on SAT tests and college entrance examinations, and on the basis of experience, Richard Nixon came to the American presidency. I think came to it as among the most intelligent presidents we've ever had, on sheer school intelligence, if you will. And two, he was one of the best prepared in terms of resume. Remember, he'd been in World War II. He was in the Navy. He'd been a congressman, a senator, 2-term vice president, and he was very well prepared for the presidency. So I've always seen what happened to him eventually as a kind of a Greek tragedy, an overworked metaphor I grant, but it was something Grecian in the tragedy of Richard Nixon. So well prepared, so smart, on paper a person who had so much promise to be a good president, but this loner, paranoid, have to destroy the opposition. They're all against me, which is capsulized by that moment, alone, by himself, on election night, is one of the keys to understanding Richard Nixon or anything about the Nixon presidency.
Yeah. I once asked Teddy White, the chronicler of presidential races, what his take on Nixon was. He said, Richard Nixon is somebody who 363 days of the year is a model citizen, upstanding, Kiwanis Club thing, and then on the one other day, he rapes his daughter in the funhouse lawn. He said, I mean, he was making a metaphor here, but he said the
pretty strong metaphor, right?
Yeah, exactly. But he said some of the things he did or authorized would just be a fight against the grain of the, the big positive side.
Well, and we'll move on for a moment, but I do find that people who were either not alive at the time of the Nixon presidency or not of memory age, are sometimes interested in, what is it? What was it with this guy? That if you'd been covering the White House for the entire Nixon presidency, as was my luck and honor to do, I think you would have come away with some of the same thoughts that I had. And that is that this all started, this loner, paranoid, they're all against me thing, somewhere deep back in either Richard Nixon's childhood or young adulthood, of an insecurity. That for all of his intelligence, for all of his experience, there was some insecurity about him, that he didn't feel comfortable around crowds of people, or for that matter, even small groups of people. It's sometimes said of presidents, well, he's not very good with crowds, but he's terrific with small people, small crowds, small gatherings of people. Other presidents have said, well, he's very good with small crowds, small gatherings of people, but not good with big crowds. Richard Nixon was not good with either one.
Right.
Which makes it, if you stop and think about it, all the more astonishing and all the greater accomplishment for him, if you want to say, that he was able to climb to the ultimate political ladder, never comfortable with crowds, nor in small groups of people. And the tip-off to this, having said, certainly I'm not qualified to psychoanalyze anybody, but the tip-off to this was, again, when you followed him as close as you could, and you observed him as close as you could, he repeatedly did things that in normal company would have been tip-offs that he has these insecurities. One, it was well known that he had cold hands, and he didn't like to shake hands with people. And let's face it, as a candidate, you have to shake hands with people all the time. But he had cold hands. Now, what that indicates, you take it to me, indicates again some little uncertainty about meeting people. And then there were his gestures. And I don't want to make fun of Richard Nixon here, but we're talking about part of why we did this book on Haldeman and Ehrlichman and others around him and what his relationships were with them, is that he would do things that were just sort of stupefying. Example, the first time he held a news conference in the East Room of the White House, if you've ever been there, next to the Oval Office itself, the most impressive room in the White House, there are portraits of George Washington and Martha Washington and Madison's around, a wonderful room. First news conference, he's been elected president. And he's taken office in early 1969 after the 1960 election. Everybody's in the room, everything's in place. He walks up to the rostrum and says, "Please be seated." Well, yeah, hilarious, I agree. But time after time, if you watched and observed, and reporters are paid to be observant, he would do things such as, reluctant to shake hands because he's worried about his hands being cold. It's one reason he always liked to have fireplaces around, by the way. And these kind of gestures, and he might say, "Over there," sort of thing. So I say, it's funny, but I don't want to wax on about it. But in understanding Richard Nixon, I think, has to understand, you pick up on these telltale signs of what happened to him. And that is one reason that both Haldeman and Ehrlichman considered it their duty to constantly praise him, to constantly pump him up, to constantly tell him how great he was, which I think anybody
Sound familiar?
tried to lead anything knows the danger of that.
When you were talking about that, Haldeman had, and you're the first one who told me this, but he had an uncanny knack for appealing to the darkest side of Nixon. First of all, he had a serious case of hero worship. He was a student at UCLA when Nixon ran for Congress and started his career. He was a militant anti-communist that fit all the right kind of things. And he sensed early this privacy and that the whole thing, that he could be of service by keeping all kinds of other people away from him. And of course, included in all the other people was the press. And Nixon's antipathy toward the press goes back to those early California years. And it was in doing the research for the book that I came across something I thought quite fascinating, and I think you did too. The story of Nixon's famous last press conference in 1962, after he lost narrowly to Kennedy for the presidential, he went out to California and ran against Governor Pat Brown. And you know, he'd been vice president for 8 years. It looked like he thought he was going to, not only did he not win, he got clobbered. And up in the hotel room, he was, even then he would drink quite a bit. And Haldeman went to work on him. He said, "This is not your fault. This is not your fault, sir. This is his press against you. They're out to get you. They're doing this. They're just hammering away." Another drink, more at it. And he was in that kind of mood when he came downstairs and said, "So, if you want to give the candidate the shaft, go ahead and give him the shaft. But try maybe to say something good once in a while. But you won't to me, because you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Gentlemen, this is my last news conference." And I'm not sure that that performance would have happened had it not been for Haldeman.
No, I don't think it would have. That Haldeman, as much as anybody, and I would argue more than anybody, during the time of the Nixon presidency, and for that matter, the '68 campaign, Nixon trusted Haldeman more than anyone else that I can think of. I think even including Mrs. Nixon. 2 points I would make. That Nixon did drink, but he was very well known, I wouldn't say notorious, for until possibly the very, very end, and I'm not even sure about that, he never had a reputation of being a heavy drinker. He was not a heavy drinker, and one reason was that he didn't handle whiskey very well, and he knew it. So when we describe Richard Nixon drinking, from what I knew at the time, and I do believe to be a fact, 2 drinks for President Nixon would be a lot. And he sort of knew it. But back to your point with Haldeman, where the bond was welded with Haldeman, that after the shattering defeat, and remember how close the 1960 election with Jack Kennedy was, it was breathtakingly close. I mean, Richard Nixon was almost there. He had his hand on the crown, so to speak, almost there. And I think you'll all agree, whether it's basketball or a political race or a race for a better job, if it's really close, particularly at the end, it's an especially difficult defeat to take. So Richard Nixon had his hand right there. It was so close that he was strongly advised to demand a recount, particularly in a couple of states, Illinois, Texas, but he didn't. But nonetheless, Haldeman was not around during that time. Where Haldeman came into the picture was after Richard Nixon was shattered by defeat in 1962. And from Nixon's viewpoint, and this is part of what we tried to weave together in the book as part of the narrative, part of it was Haldeman comes along and says, in effect, "Look, I've run a big organization." He was an advertising man. Let me show you how to win. Let me organize, and let me get the right people, and let me show you how to win. So Haldeman, being an advertising man, ran a landmark breakthrough in terms of techniques election for the presidency in 1968, bringing it to the fore advertising and public relations techniques that he had used in the advertising industry, such things as never put the candidate, if you can possibly help it, never put the candidate, never put Nixon in any terrain that he does not dominate. So if you're going to have a, quote, press conference, we don't want to open it up to all the press. We're going to have a very few people, and if we can, just, if you will, paper the audience. And it's a televised news. And a guy named Roger Ailes helped Haldeman develop this technique. But the point is that the '68 campaign was a new look-ahead campaign for which Haldeman was the basic architect of that campaign, with Ailes and some others. Now, so Richard Nixon is suddenly transposed from being a classic loser to, well, suddenly he's a winner. So why wouldn't he depend on Haldeman? So you say, why did he depend so much on Haldeman? In his mind, Haldeman was the key to bringing him out of the ashes of defeat into the winner's circle.
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah. He also, to give the devil his due, because as you kept telling me, his sense of imaging and everything that he had at J. Walter Thompson had some very strong positive results. Dan once described how Haldeman set up the trip to China as, he said, it was his masterpiece, his Sistine Chapel. I mean, from the point of the plane landing in Beijing at prime time across the board, 7 o'clock in New York, 10 o'clock on the coast, everything was brilliantly orchestrated. And he was always fiddling with stuff like that, and talking about elections. When it came time to go for re-election, he was always polling and taking things, and he came up with evidence that a lot of people did not find the mere name Nixon appealing. Forget about the candidate. So they came up with this whole new fellow. It was either elect your president, elect our president, and then they said, elect the president. You know, what's his name? I mean, it was he would, this kind of fine-tuning.
Well, Haldeman's Bible for Richard Nixon was prepare, plan, leave nothing to chance. And you're quite right that the Nixon trip to China as a production was Haldeman's Sistine Chapel, and I think while it's rarely thought of that way, in the annals of advertising, public relations, and public imagery, it stands as the most successful, extended, and right at the top level that could be pulled off. And Haldeman was very proud of it because leave nothing to chance. Minute by minute, second by second, visualizing every venue and what the image would be, what the optic would be anytime the president was seen on television. Now, to give Haldeman his due, this is a tremendous undertaking. He didn't do it alone, but he organized and did it, and so we have to give him credit for it. And again, you know, it underscores even more so now, after the trip to China, which was the centerpiece of their '72 election campaign, let's face it, that Haldeman's position was better than ever. Ehrlichman, who did not have as long a history with President Nixon, not nearly as long as Haldeman, was sort of, Ehrlichman was Haldeman's Haldeman.
Yeah.
Haldeman was Nixon's Haldeman, and Ehrlichman was Haldeman's Haldeman, if you will. And one of, by the way, John Ehrlichman's jobs was to massage journalists, massage being kind of work them over psychologically with a piece of hose, if you could. Ehrlichman did not see many journalists. He prided himself on not seeing journalists, except if the president complained to Haldeman, or Haldeman saw something he didn't like, and it was a high-profile journalist. I'm not aggrandizing myself, but somebody with that work. At any rate, I found myself in John Ehrlichman's office, having called him almost every day for a month, and he never answered a telephone call. But he had seen 2 or 3 days of reporting, and at any rate, I came into his office, and we recount this in the book. And the first thing I noticed was a briefcase on the floor. To any experienced reporter, a briefcase on the floor, whether true or not, means be careful, they're probably recording this conversation. But at any rate, that Ehrlichman was, I was in his presence for him to tell me how dissatisfied they were with my reporting and CBS News in general. It was pretty much a diatribe, in the course of which he said at one point, he said, you know, the basic problem with you, rather, as opposed to the network as a whole, which he was giving him, the problem with you is people believe you. And I tried to be a gentleman about it, and I don't know, mumbled something about, well, I'm glad to hear that because I thought that was my job or something. But anyway, just a flash of insight that that's the sort of thing that Ehrlichman did on a widespread basis for Haldeman.
I want to bring up, because we've indicated that I think the attitude toward the press, the attitude toward anyone outside us who were not inner circle, us versus them, they could be members of the cabinet. If they were not on Haldeman's okay list, forget it. Because he loved controlling access. He was better than that than any chief of staff ever, bar none. You just could not break through that wall. And that's basically, and then he had his minions, Ehrlichman had his minions, and all that led to that rubric of crimes we call Watergate, which went far beyond the burglary brigade. But I want to bring up something else. Dan referred to Nixon's first news conference. One of my favorite news conferences, and by the way, I don't know if any of you noticed it at the time, but there was rather, forget about CBS, it somehow had a kind of visceral effect on Nixon. All he'd say is, Dan Rather, CBS News, and all kinds of neuralgic tics and things would flash across his face, you know? Remember? Yeah. And my favorite was in the summer of '73, the Urban Committee hearings had just ended, and there was an outdoor news conference. It was going along nicely. My friend here gets up and said, Mr. President, I just was kind of wonder what goes on in your thoughts, in your innermost mind, when you hear talk, as we've been hearing lately, about impeachment. This is '73. This is the first time anybody had mentioned impeachment. And I'm telling you, for the viewer who was studying, the convulsions that caused were amazing. I'm sure you remember the day, and we've talked about this. You have no explanation for this, do you?
Well, you know, a lot of what you do, I appreciate you mentioning it, and I can, but I will not tell you any number of news conferences in which I thought my question was pretty limp and failed. So, but at this particular news conference, well, you know, the thought had been building not just in White House reporters' minds. The thought had been building in the country, not with everybody, but with people who followed politics, of impeachment as a possibility. For a very long time during the investigation of Richard Nixon, first it was, this is terrible about this burglarizing of the Watergate, but you know what? At most it was some people involved with the campaign. Nobody in the White House would ever have anything to do with that. And I, among others, took that view in the very beginning, saying, well, you want to stay alert and ask questions, but it's highly unlikely that anybody at the White House would have had anything to do with that. Then, after it became clear that, well, yes, some people in the White House did have something to do with it, Eagle Crow and some other people down at the low level, then it was, well, okay, some people in the White House involved, but certainly it will never get to the Haldeman, Ehrlichman level. It's never going to get there. But time after, you know, it just began creeping up. So by the time we got to this particular news conference in late 1973, there was some talk of, well, you know, if this really goes a long way, maybe somebody will start talking about impeachment. So one of the things you try to do at a news conference, if you're a White House correspondent and get recognized, is you try to ask a question that counts. Not being preachy about it, what's journalism about? You want to do journalism that matters, journalism that counts, so you're thinking to yourself. And I usually went in a news conference with at least 7 to 9 questions in my head, in order that I prefer to ask them. The reason being, you have to size up the situation. One, somebody else might ask the question before you. Number two, you feel the moment you feel in the room. So in answer to your question, Gary, I didn't give it a lot of serious thought, my recollection was it was about number 4 on my list of questions. I'd love to tell you, listen, I'd love to tell you I was prescient. I saw impeachment coming, and I really was, that's not true. It came my turn, and at that second, if you want to use a football analogy, to call an audible and say, you know, it may be time to ask this impeachment question. But these decisions...
I'm fascinated with the first 3 words. That was the 4th.
These decisions are made in a nanosecond. The preparation, not the preparation. And I didn't think about it at the time. It's the first time, certainly in the modern presidency, that any reporter has asked any president about impeachment. None of that was in my head at all.
Right, I can understand that. Well, there's lots we could go on with. It occurs to me we've mentioned a hostility toward the press, an us versus them mentality, a lingering obsession with past grievances, and an impeachment. Does any of that apply to any other president?
Nothing comes to mind.
Seriously, the Trump thing with Hillary, I just thought was unique and unprecedented and everything. And then I began looking back at some of the notes for the Palace Guide. When Nixon would get under stress and other things, he would go on a rant that would go something like this. He said, "They're doing it to me again. They're doing it to me again. This all goes back to Elger Hiss. So this all goes back to Elger Hiss." He said, "They said I was wrong, that they weren't in me. Well, I showed them I was right. They've never forgiven me for it. I brought down one of their own." And this kind of thing. We're talking 20 years earlier.
Well, there's certainly similarities, just to come right to point, there's certainly similarities with what's happening now here late in the second decade of the 21st century. There are bloodlines that run back to the Nixon presidency and Watergate. However, I've said consistently and will repeat here, I think there's some danger of overstating the similarities. Different time, different president, different country in many ways, in terms of demographics and culturally with different countries. The similarities are, I think, fairly obvious. That you have a president who has increasingly gotten himself under siege, a president who wants to attack the press as a partisan, political, and ideological weapon. It's a president suspected, use the word now with Trump, suspected, nothing's been proved, but a long list of suspected acts that were at the very minimum unpresidential and possibly illegal. So all that is similar. Here's what's different, and the reason I think it's important to keep in mind the difference between the Trump era and the Nixon era, the Watergate time and this time. The Watergate crimes, and again I repeat for emphasis, remember this was a widespread criminal conspiracy in which the president led himself. More than 40 people were charged with felonies as a result. But all of those crimes were domestic crimes, which is to say it was Americans committing crimes against other Americans. On the periphery, there were one or two suspicious things, but it was basically, to get the point, everybody involved is an American citizen or connected with the United States, by and large. That's a big difference between today, when what's being investigated is foreign influence in an election, established fact that you had substantial foreign influence in the election. What hasn't been proven is for what purpose, to what end, how to succeed and all that. But you see the difference. Watergate, all domestic. What we're talking about today is potentially, use the word, potentially much bigger and much more dangerous in that it involves a foreign power. So there is that difference. There's also this difference that Richard Nixon, for all of the downside things about him, Richard Nixon actually believed in the American institutions of government. He actually believed that it was important to have an independent judiciary. He actually believed in the independence of Congress. Remember, he'd served in Congress for a long time. And even with the press, with Nixon believed in the press as part of the system of checks and balances. It's just he wanted them all going this way. But you see the difference. With the present president, and I'm not here on any anti-Trump tirade, but with the present president, it's been the case from the very beginning. He, number one, seemingly has no understanding of what and who the institutions are, and no understanding of where they fit in the system of checks and balances. And he has no reluctance. Those who like him think they see it as a strength, but he has no reluctance to personally attack the judiciary, the Congress when it doesn't suit him, the press, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, out of the president's own mouth, and he attacks them both as individual institutions and with individuals within those institutions. He, out of his own mouth, he will call individual reporters unspeakable names with decent people such as here. He will mock a reporter with physical challenges. I mean, this is unprecedented. You see the difference? President Nixon might use Vice President Spiro Agnew to make these attacks, or to use somebody else to make these attacks. But Nixon personally never would speak out and say, that the whole institution of the American judiciary, never mind individual judges, are enemies of the people, or the president of the people. It's a big difference.
Something you mentioned about a week ago when we were talking, because it's right in this area. Nixon would never, ever, ever have been a Twitter kind of guy. He put all his stuff, that's just, the tapes were in private. He wanted to get this out of his system. He wanted it on a record of his real feelings of hate. But the idea of him stepping out and saying these kind of things, he would never do it. The extraordinary thing about Trump is that he's just, well, letting it all hang out. And another quick story of a parallel, because it's just so recent. This whole move on the part of the Trump lawyers to sort of say, okay, here's what no, you can't talk to our guy. No. But we will go through the things and send you a nice summary of whatever we're doing, and then if you have any follow-up questions. This is straight out of the Nixon playbook of the fall of 1973. People forget that what put the Saturday Night Massacre in motion was Archibald Cox was calling for the tapes that were selling in tapes. No, you can't have those, executive privilege. So what? Meanwhile, Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman was sitting around figuring out how they're going to deal with this. And this is one of the wonderful perversions of language I can think of. At one point, one of them said, well, we can't let it all hang out. So out of that came a decision to go with what they called the modified limited hangout route, which of course is totally meaningless, right? I think that was Ehrlichman's contribution. And what they suggested about this was that, forgive me for laughing, it's so absurd. They offered what they thought was a statesman-like decision, that Senator John Stennis from Mississippi, who was respected on both sides of the aisle, he was a pillar of the establishment and everything, that they would allow him to listen to the tapes and compare them with the transcripts they had, and it would all just be fine. They assumed that Archibald Cox was the only person in Washington who didn't know that John Stennis was deaf as a post. I could hardly hear anybody around the room. And so Cox said, nothing doing. And in his response to say, nothing doing, give us the tapes. He got fired, and then that Saturday Night Massacre happened, and a few weeks later, the articles of impeachment were started on their way to go.
The hour is beginning to go late. Unfortunately, I've got someplace I've got to be, and if we're going to open it up to questions.
Sure, please. Great idea.
Do so, but I want to say again that the name of the book was and is The Palace Guard. It's out of print now, but if you're interested, I do recommend if you can put your hands on it. The paperback is a little bit better than the hardback. We were so pressed to get the thing done, and so much happened between the time the book got published and later. But either way, and again, I appreciate you being here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. Your recitation about Haldeman and Ehrlichman leads me to the one fact that joined the two that neither of you mentioned. They were both Christian scientists. Mm-hmm. And at the time, as you, I'm sure, know, there was a theory that they had insinuated themselves in the White House to influence the national political agenda. So my question is, what story was most uncovered before the election in 2016? Was it how the Trump campaign succeeded in the complete vilification of Hillary Clinton? Or was it the role of the Catholic Church with Mike Pence, Ted Cruz, the Mercers, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and the Supreme Court and their agenda?
Well, as to the first, it's true. I mean, I would consider it a provable fact that both Haldeman and Ehrlichman came out of Christian Science background. That's true. And it is true that they worked pretty hard, particularly Haldeman, before the 1968 election, not to keep it secret, but to downplay it, which is not unusual for political purposes. As for the latter, the conspiracy theory or whatever it is about the Catholics in the 1916 election, I will say to you that I haven't heard much about that, and I don't know much about it.
That's my question. Is it the most underreported story of the election?
Well, I mean this very respectfully, but you know, as reporters, you get paid to check things out. There used to be the rule in the White House, you trust your mother, but you cut the cards. Which is a way of saying that if indeed it is the story, I'm not passing judgment having said to you that I'm only vaguely aware that there are people who believe this. The first thing to establish is it a story? Is it true? If it is, then I would agree with you that it's underreported. These kinds of stories are very hard to nail down. This is no excuse for journalism because we get paid to do the difficult stories. But these kinds of stories are very hard to nail down with facts. But I will say this, that the time of the Nixon thing taught me that the truth will out. That anybody who's worked the police beat know the police usually say, look, it may take time, may take a long time, but murder will out, truth will out. And if this story is a story, and if it's true, it may take a while, but I'm willing to bet you it'll come out. And if it's a story, it's a very important story.
Dan, over here.
I think I remember reading, possibly in your book, but certainly it's common knowledge, that during the Nixon administration, in his last days, when he was drinking and talking to portraits and kneeling and all the rest, that the word was out from Kissinger and Haig and Schlesinger that if he, in his drunken moment, decided to press the proverbial button, they were to go through them. And I was wondering whether there's any similar check that you know of, you've heard about, with this president.
I don't think it's ever been proven that happened near the end of the Nixon administration. There were certainly reports of that,
Yeah.
but it's never been proven to my satisfaction. In my personal opinion, italicized clear label, my personal opinion is that it never reached that stage. Because rightly or wrongly, as Commander-in-Chief, the President, whether anybody agrees with him or doesn't agree with him, has the final authority over the proverbial nuclear trigger. So one, I don't think it happened during the Nixon administration. And two, I would doubt very seriously that it's happened with this president this time. For first of all, both the major players, the Secretary of Defense himself, the White House Chief of Staff, and the head of the National Security Council are all former generals, and in at least two cases, Marine generals. These aren't the kind of guys who break command. So while someone would say it's not a very good system, It's certainly something worth discussing, but the situation was during the Nixon time, and I think it is now. If Nixon, at the very end, had decided to fire nuclear weapons, I know of nothing was in place to prevent him from doing that. And to make you sleep better at night, that situation prevails to this day. If Donald Trump decides to send nuclear weapons, God forbid on his own, and I'd like to believe that he wouldn't do that on his own, but if he decided to do so, that he has the legal power to do so, and now we're pretty far afield. But in the nightmare scenario, if the president says fire, I think the people below him would fire. The people in nuclear submarines around the world that are waiting, as you know, nuclear subs, they have a two-key system, that no one person can fire the nuclear weapon from nuclear sub. But if the president says to nuclear submarine commanders, fire, they'll go to the two-key system and fire. I know it's a frightening prospect, but I believe that to be the case. Thank you.
Ralph Peters, who's an analyst for Fox, has resigned, calling Fox a propaganda machine. How does the fact that an entire network seems to reflect the agenda of the administration change the view of the American public in terms of trusting its press to be objective and neutral?
You want to take that?
I think it's very alarming. I mean, extremely alarming. They are not a news organization, they're a propaganda machine. The only thing that maybe, don't you have the feeling that they're pretty much only watched by the true believers? I mean, that hardcore, or I won't say watched, but that they're influenced. I just don't, I can't think of anything, something that they've done it went into policy. I can think of a lot of things where they've been the cheerleader behind these things, but does anyone not realize that Fox is totally biased?
Well, on this subject, on this subject, you know, there's news of this today, that the man who's billed as Fox's strategic analyst, a retired Army general who's been there for more than 20 years, has written, he quit. And he said he quit because so much of Fox's programming, his words, not mine, that it's a propaganda machine, pure and simple propaganda machine. And he pointed out that they, in his view, unrelentingly and unconscionably attack the courts. And he said, you know, with Robert Mueller, a distinguished war hero, former combat marine, and so forth. So there are people within Fox, but I do think maybe this is cutting it too fine for most people. Look, much of their commentary is a quote, propaganda machine, as this man described it. There are people at Fox who I personally know and are good reporters and do some really good reporting. The problem for them is basically their nighttime programming. That's the basic thing with them. That's the red beating heart of the propaganda machine for about 7:30, 8 o'clock on through 11 o'clock at midnight. But increasingly people within Fox who see what it is will say what this man said, that it's a propaganda machine, which a lot of people have suspected for a long time. And most of them, and there's several now, most of them also point out that they think it was a missed opportunity. Their view and the view of this retired colonel talking about this morning, I'm sorry I can't call his name, is that the Republicans had a great chance to establish a legitimate conservative counterbalance voice to what many of them perceive to be a left-leaning press, and that they would have been and would be much better off if they tried to be a legitimate news organization trying to give fair and accurate information rather than making a quick and fairly cheap grab for the ratings and demographics by becoming the quote propaganda machine.
And two more questions, one over here.
Hi, Dan. I'm in network TV news. I'm a network television producer, and I read your post today where you posted about this item. A lot of us follow you on social media, and I'm curious. You talked today about Fox News in your social media post, but I'm curious what your assessment is if you were to give a report card today of current network broadcast news. There are concerns beyond Fox about other networks, and I'm curious as to what you think, given your experience. And as a brief follow-up, I'm just curious, you've got such a big following. So many of us in newsrooms follow you on social media and your commentary. What are your thoughts on what your voice is? Are you surprised by your following, and do you feel like you have more of a voice now in this new age of social media than you did perhaps?
Well, there's
behind
much
the
in that
scenes?
question, and first of all, let me answer, am I surprised that my Facebook posts and the post, which we call newsandguts.com, has developed a fairly large following? No, I'm not surprised. I'm totally astonished. And I mean that. I am very grateful. I'm extremely grateful for it. I don't profess to understand it. The young people that I work with in my company called News and Guts, who took me to social media, I didn't want anything to do with social media. I thought I was born too soon for social media. But the young people came to me and said, Dan, if you want to be in the conversation, if you want to be anywhere close to relevant, it's not an option. It's imperative. So that's how we, took to it. When it became, by most reasonable assessments, successful, and I have no illusions. There are people who have much greater following, but it's been surprisingly, astonishingly successful. What I've tried to do, what I am trying to do, is basically say, look, folks, what you have in me, I'm a reporter who got lucky, very lucky. I've been around a while, I've been a few places, and if I can add any context and perspective, particularly historical context and perspective to what's happening, and if I can provide an anywhere sometimes reasonably steady and reasonable voice, that's what I set out to do. And it's my best analysis with the young, particularly with the young people we have as followers, that's what's attracted them. But, day to day, I'm always scratching my head what to write, how to write it, when to write it, because there's an awful lot about social media that is as complicated as a hydrogen plant diagram, wiring diagram or something to me. I don't profess to understand much about it, but as I say, I'm really grateful for it.
I think we should write a book about it.
If you'll be my co-author.
Last question. Dan, I want to go back to your reference to Rather's rules of proximity and power. Whose voices today are most influential, if anyone's voices are, to our current president?
Well, first, I'm going to try to answer the question, but keep in mind that I'm not only no longer a chief White House correspondent, I'm not a White House correspondent at all. But, I still work the phones and talk to people and try to observe. And I think the answer to your question, that with President Trump, it's pretty clear to me that members of his family are the most influential people with him. It's very hard to tell what, if any, influence his wife has on him. You and I both know that, generally speaking, a man's wife has tremendous influence on him unless he chooses to seal her out, as President Nixon did with Mrs. Nixon. But I have no idea about Mrs. Trump. But I think with his children, and to a degree, at least one of his son-in-laws, there's every indication that they have the most influence on him. And this has created tension, which has been on the front page for some time. Kelly, the former Marine four-star general, who came in to be White House Chief of Staff and to bring some semblance of order to the staff, has obviously been in conflict with his boss, the president, about who has access. As I get it, Kelly basically said, if I want to take this job and try to bring some order out of your White House, Mr. President, then I have to control access. This is what Haldeman and what Gary described earlier. Haldeman said, nobody but nobody gets the president. They don't get to him by phone, they don't see him in person, they don't get a single piece of paper unless it goes through me. Well, Kelly has tried to implement a version of that. And from what I can read, he was told by the president, okay, I need this. But it hasn't happened. So in answer to your question, with power in Washington is direct relation to proximity. I think the family members are the closest to this president and have the most influence on him. He's also, one of the things about Trump, that he's, in his own mind at least, he's a loyalty player. Now, a lot of people who've been fired lately would laugh at that, but he remembers people. And this is my blue plate special of the day. This is my opinion. I think he still depends, I think he talks to Roger Stone, Roger Stone's a long-time advisor way back. I don't think he talks to him all that often. We talk about proximity of power. But I think that Stone, this is what I think, not what I know, that Stone has proximity by the telephone just about any time he wants it.
May I just add, let me just add one thing to that. One thing we didn't mention, I think it's fair to say that Bob Haldeman established the template for what has become the chief of staff. You look back at previous presidents, Kennedy didn't have anybody like that, Johnson did. Eisenhower did with Sherman Adams, but that was almost more of an appointment secretary kind of thing. Haldeman made it a position of power that it never had.
Well, that's a good point. I have to move, but that's a good point because Ronald Reagan took Jim Baker.
Right.
And Baker, who was, for my money, a whole lot more intelligent and gentle than Haldeman, still worked off that template.
Yeah.
What's wrong with Texas, Dan?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.